Welcome back to the sinister side. Before we dive in, I want you to do one thing. Comment below, where are you watching this from and what time is it right now? Because tonight's story isn't just history, it's a secret history, one that society tried to erase. In 1842, in the port city of Mobile, Alabama, a woman crossed a line so forbidden that even whispers could ruin lives. It involved power, race, law, and a marriage that should never have existed. What unfolded behind closed doors was so dangerous, so carefully hidden, that records disappeared, witnesses fell silent, and the truth was buried for generations. This isn't a story about love. It's not even a story about defiance. It's the story of a widow, a man she was never allowed to claim, and a union the law declared impossible. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this marriage still haunts the shadows of American history. Mobile in the early 1840s was a city that believed it understood itself completely. It stood confidently on the edge of the Gulf, prosperous and proud, convinced that its order was natural and eternal. The docks were always busy, crowded with ships arriving heavy with goods and leaving even heavier with cotton, timber, and the invisible weight of human suffering. To an outsider, Mobile looked like success carved into brick and wood, a place where civilization had tamed the wilderness and turned it into profit. But to truly know the city, one had to listen not to what was said, but to what was carefully avoided. Every morning began the same way. The heat arrived early, pressing down on rooftops and narrow streets, forcing people into predictable routines. Merchants opened their shops, clerks counted ledgers, church doors stood ready for the faithful, and enslaved men and women moved through the city performing labor so essential that it became invisible. Their presence was constant, yet their humanity was denied so completely that most white citizens no longer noticed the contradiction. This blindness was not accidental. It was taught, reinforced, and rewarded. Mobile functioned on rules that were rarely written but always understood. Who could speak, who must remain silent, who could walk freely, and who needed permission for every step. All of this was known without explanation. The city trained its people early. Children absorbed these truths before they could read. By adulthood, obedience felt like common sense rather than submission. Race was the foundation of everything. It defined social standing, legal rights, and moral worth. White citizens lived within a structure designed to protect them, while black citizens, enslaved or free, existed within a structure designed to control them. The law was explicit, but the culture was even more ruthless. A person did not need to break a statute to be punished. Suspicion alone could be enough. Women occupied a particularly delicate position. They were valued as symbols of purity, order, and family honor, yet i.e. true authority. Their safety depended entirely on male protection, a father, a husband, or a guardian. Without one, a woman became something dangerous in the eyes of society, unpredictable. Independence in a woman was treated not as strength, but as a flaw waiting to become a scandal. Widowhood, therefore, was not merely a state of grief, it was a social crisis. A widow was watched closely, judged quietly, and expected to follow an unwritten script. She was allowed sorrow but not freedom. She could manage household affairs but only temporarily. The expectation was clear: she would either retreat into quiet respectability or remarry appropriately and restore order. Any deviation invited speculation, and speculation in Mobile had teeth. The city thrived on observation. Windows were always open, figuratively if not literally. Conversations paused when someone unfamiliar entered a room. Neighbors noticed who visited whom, how long they stayed, and at what hour they left. Nothing truly private remained so for long. Reputation was the most fragile possession anyone could have, and once damaged, it rarely recovered. Wealth might shield a person for a time, but even wealth had limits. Religion gave this surveillance a moral vocabulary. Sermons spoke of God's design, of hierarchy and obedience, of sin and punishment. These messages reinforced the idea that the social order was not merely human-made, but divinely approved. Questioning it was not just rebellious, it was sinful. This belief allowed cruelty to wear the mask of righteousness. It made enforcement feel holy. Yet despite all this, Mobile was full of human contradictions. Desire did not disappear simply because it was forbidden. Loneliness did not vanish because it was inconvenient. People felt things they were not supposed to feel, and they learned how to bury those feelings beneath duty and silence. The city became skilled at producing double lives. What mattered was not what one felt, but what one showed. At night, Mobile revealed more of its true nature. The heat lingered, pressing against skin and nerves alike. Lanterns lit streets unevenly, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. This was when conversations grew quieter and intentions more complicated. Deals were struck, secrets exchanged, and lines approached but rarely crossed. Everyone understood how far was too far, or believed they did. The laws regarding race were particularly unforgiving. Interracial relationships existed, but they were never acknowledged publicly, and they were always defined by power and coercion. The idea of equality between races was not just rejected, it was considered absurd and dangerous. Marriage across racial lines was unthinkable, legally impossible, and morally condemned. Such a union threatened the very logic of the system. If love could cross that boundary, then the boundary itself was exposed as artificial. The city responded to that threat with force and erasure. People who violated the taboos did not simply face punishment, they vanished from polite society. Their names stopped being spoken. Their stories were altered or forgotten. Records were incomplete, deliberately vague, or destroyed. Mobile did not like reminders of its own fragility. And yet, history rarely obeys the rules imposed upon it. Beneath the city's confidence lay insecurity. Its wealth depended on an institution it feared to examine too closely. Its morality relied on silence. Its stability required everyone to play their part without deviation. This made Mobile powerful, but it also made it brittle. Small disruptions were tolerated if they could be contained. Large ones were not. The city had little patience for ambiguity. You were either aligned with its values or suspected of undermining them. Neutrality did not exist. This environment produced compliance, but it also produced tension, a constant pressure beneath the surface. People learned how to survive within this pressure. They learned which questions not to ask, which thoughts not to voice, and which truths to ignore. The city rewarded this discipline with safety. Those who mastered the art of silence lived comfortably. Those who did not paid a price. For enslaved people, silence was enforced by violence and law. Their lives were regulated so completely that even their emotions were considered property of someone else. Love, grief, hope, none of it was recognized. To acknowledge their inner lives would have complicated the system too much, so the city chose denial instead. This denial shaped everything. It allowed citizens to attend church in the morning and oversee brutality in the afternoon without confronting the contradiction. It allowed families to speak of honor while benefiting from exploitation. It allowed Mobile to believe itself civilized while practicing cruelty as routine. Change, when it came, did not arrive as a public declaration. It arrived quietly, in moments easily dismissed at the time, a decision made behind closed doors, a risk taken in private, a boundary crossed without witnesses. These moments rarely seemed important at first. The city was too confident to notice them. But confidence can be dangerous. It creates blind spots. It convinces those in power that their control is absolute. Mobile believed its rules were unbreakable because no one had ever dared to challenge them openly. What it failed to consider was the power of choices made in silence. This was a city that recorded what it wanted, remembered, and discarded the rest. Official histories spoke of prosperity, faith, and tradition. They did not speak of fear, loneliness, or forbidden attachments. Those stories lived only in fragments, passed quietly or lost altogether. And within this carefully maintained order, something began to form that did not fit. It did not announce itself. It did not seek attention. It existed quietly, growing in the spaces where the city was least vigilant. It was born from circumstances the LA.W. could not fully control and emotions the culture refused to acknowledge. Mobile did not see it coming because it did not want to. To recognize it would have meant admitting that the system was not as absolute as it claimed. That possibility was more frightening than any scandal, so the city continued as it always had, confident in its rules, secure in its hierarchy, unaware that a story was unfolding within its borders that would test the limits of everything it believed about race, power, and belonging. A story that began not with rebellion or defiance, but with quiet decisions, made by individuals navigating a world designed to deny them choice. This was the environment that shaped what came next, a place where silence was survival, where law and custom worked together to crush deviation, and where the most dangerous acts were not those committed in public, but those carried out quietly, beyond the reach of immediate judgment. And from within this city of rules and whispers, a widow would soon step into a role she was never meant to occupy, and a man denied even the right to his own name would become central to a story Mobile tried desperately to forget. When the news of her husband's death spread through Mobile, it did not arrive with shock, it arrived with calculation. People measured the loss not by emotion but by consequence. Who would inherit the property? Who would control the household? How long would the mourning last before order was restored? In Mobile, death was never just personal, it was administrative. The widow understood this almost immediately. Grief was expected, but only in controlled amounts. She was permitted sorrow, but not unpredictability. Her black clothing, her lowered eyes, her quiet presence at church were all noted and approved. Mourning, when performed correctly, reassured the city that nothing had truly changed. But beneath the rituals, something had shifted in a way the city could not fully see. For the first time in her adult life, she was alone. Not alone in the sense of isolation, the house was still full of movement, voices, and labor, but alone in authority. Her husband's absence created a vacuum that the law reluctantly allowed her to fill. She became the legal overseer of property, finances, and people. It was a role she had been trained to assist in, never to command. Now she occupied it fully, and that unsettled those who noticed. Widows were expected to exist quietly. They were meant to preserve what had been built, not question it. Her neighbors watched closely for signs of deviation. Too much confidence would look suspicious, too little would invite intervention. She learned quickly how narrow the path was and how easily one could fall from it. Outwardly, she did everything correctly. She received condolences with grace. She attended church faithfully. She did not linger in conversation. She avoided drawing attention. Yet even as she followed the script, the city sensed something different. There was a subtle shift in how she moved through rooms, how she spoke to men who had once deferred to her husband. She was not defiant, but she was no longer invisible. Her household became a place of quiet scrutiny. Visitors noted changes they could not quite name. The routines remained the same, but the tone had altered. Decisions were made without consulting male relatives. Instructions were given with certainty rather than hesitation. None of this violated the law, but it challenged expectation. Mobile tolerated widows who were fragile. It respected widows who were temporary. It distrusted widows who appeared capable. At night, when the house grew still, her grief took on a different shape. It was no longer the sharp pain of loss, but a dull awareness of possibility. She felt it in moments she would never have admitted aloud. The realization that her life, for the first time, was not entirely dictated by another's will. This awareness frightened her as much as it intrigued her. She knew the danger of such thoughts. Independence was not a virtue for women in Mobile, it was a liability. A woman who seemed too comfortable alone invited rumors. A widow who delayed remarriage raised questions. Each passing month without a suitable match increased the city's interest in her private life. Men noticed her differently now, not with desire, but with assessment. Some saw opportunity, others saw risk. Few saw her as a person. She was a position to be managed, a problem to be solved, a resource to be controlled. This realization hardened something inside her. She had lived her entire marriage within clear boundaries. Her husband's authority had defined her world, for better or worse. His absence forced her to confront how much of herself had been shaped by compliance. The city expected her to replicate that compliance with another man. She was expected to restore balance by surrendering control once more. But control, once tasted, does not disappear easily. Her days became a careful performance. Every gesture was measured, every interaction was filtered through caution. She understood that a single misstep could redefine her in the eyes of the city. Respectability was fragile, and she was its custodian now. Within her household, power dynamics shifted subtly. Those who served watched her closely, noticing changes the city could not see. She spoke more directly. She listened more carefully. Her presence carried a weight it had not carried before. This unsettled some and intrigued others. She was aware of these observations, even when they were never voiced. Awareness became her armor. She paid attention to how people looked at her, how conversations changed when she entered a room. She learned the language of silence, the pauses that revealed more than words. Grief isolated her in unexpected ways. Friends offered sympathy but kept their distance, unsure of how to engage with a woman no longer neatly categorized. Social invitations became fewer. When they came, Hay carried unspoken expectations. The city was patient, but not indefinitely. In moments of solitude, she reflected on the life she had been handed and the one she might shape. These reflections were dangerous. She did not indulge them openly, but they existed nonetheless, growing stronger with time. The city mistook her restraint for weakness. It assumed she would eventually submit to its expectations. It had seen widows before. It believed it knew how the story ended. What the city did not see was the quiet resolve forming beneath her careful exterior. She was learning how the system worked, where it bent and where it broke. Learning how much could be done without attracting attention, learning how power could be exercised softly. Her position placed her at the center of contradictions she had never been forced to confront before. She benefited from a system that restricted her, depended on people it dehumanized, and punished deviations it secretly relied upon. These contradictions had always existed, but now they pressed against her directly. She could no longer ignore them. The house itself became a reflection of her inner state, familiar yet altered, safe yet uncertain. Every room carried echoes of her past and questions about her future. She moved through it differently now, noticing details she had once overlooked. Outside, the city continued its routines, confident in its predictability. It did not suspect that within one of its respectable households something was changing that could not be easily corrected. She understood the risk of standing out, but she also understood the cost of disappearing. Widowhood had given her a narrow window, temporary, conditional but real. What she chose to do within it would define the rest of her life. And somewhere within this fragile balance, a presence existed that would soon disrupt everything she believed she controlled. A presence tied to her household, her authority, and the system she was navigating so carefully. A presence the city would never accept as part of her story. At this stage, nothing had been spoken aloud. No lines had been crossed, no laws had been broken. But history rarely marks its turning points with announcements. They begin in silence, with awareness, with restraint stretched just enough to tremble. The widow stood at the edge of that silence, not yet aware of how deeply her choices would entangle her with a man the law insisted should remain invisible. And as Mobile watched her with cautious curiosity, believing it still held the upper hand, the foundations of its certainty were already beginning to shift. He had no name that mattered to the city. On paper, he existed only as an entry in an inventory, a line among many that reduced a human life to value and function. If spoken of at all, it was never with the language reserved for men. He was referred to indirectly, vaguely, as though specificity itself might grant him too much presence. In Mobile, naming carried power, and power was something the system refused to give him. To the outside world, he blended seamlessly into the background of daily life. He rose before dawn, moved when instructed, spoke when required, and remained silent the rest of the time. His body performed labor the city depended on, yet his inner life was never acknowledged. This was not unusual. The city had perfected the art of looking through people like him rather than at them. But invisibility did not mean emptiness. He observed more than anyone realized. Those denied agency often become experts in attention. He learned the rhythms of the household, the moods of its occupants, the subtle signals that preceded conflict or calm. He understood how power shifted from room to room, how tone and posture revealed more than words. Survival required this awareness. His past was fragmented, not because it did not exist, but because it was dangerous to remember too clearly. Memory could become a liability. Still, fragments remained, impressions of another life, another identity, carried quietly like contraband. He never spoke of them. Speech invited questions, and questions invited consequences. Within the widow's household, His role placed him close enough to observe authority without ever possessing it. He existed in a space defined by contradiction. He was essential, yet disposable, trusted with responsibility, yet denied autonomy. This balance was deliberate. It kept him useful and powerless at the same time. When the husband died, the shift was immediate, though subtle. Authority changed hands, but routines remained. To an outsider, nothing appeared different. To someone paying attention, everything was. The widow's presence altered the atmosphere of the house. Her voice carried differently. Decisions came more directly. There was less hesitation, less deferral. These changes were quiet, but they were unmistakable. He noticed them immediately. He also noticed how others responded. Some tested her authority in small ways, delaying compliance or questioning instructions that had once been accepted without hesitation. Others adjusted quickly, sensing the importance of aligning themselves correctly. He watched these interactions carefully, understanding the stakes better than most. His own position required particular caution. Any misinterpretation of his behavior could be dangerous. The system allowed no margin for error. He moved carefully, spoke minimally, and never assumed familiarity. Yet proximity has its own risks. Being near authority, even passively, invites scrutiny. He had learned long ago how to appear smaller than he was, how to occupy space without claiming it, how to lower his gaze at the right moment, how to make himself unremarkable. These skills were not taught, they were learned through necessity. Despite this, the widow's attention occasionally lingered in ways that unsettled him, not with suspicion and not with cruelty, but with awareness. Awareness was dangerous. T acknowledged his presence as something more than a function. He did not know how to interpret it, and that uncertainty made him wary. Their interactions were brief, proper, and restrained. Anything else would have been unthinkable. Still, within these exchanges existed something the city did not account for: recognition. It was not spoken. It did not announce itself. It existed in moments easily dismissed by others, but impossible to ignore once noticed. He understood the boundaries better than anyone. He had spent his life navigating them. He knew how quickly they could become weapons. The law was clear, but the culture was even clearer. Any suggestion of familiarity beyond prescribed roles could be fatal, not just socially, but physically. Yet the widow's authority complicated these rules. She occupied a position that was temporary and conditional. She was allowed to command, but only within limits. Those limits were enforced not just by law, but by expectation. Her awareness of him did not break any rule outright, but it unsettled the careful balance the system relied upon. He sensed this tension, even when it was never articulated. He had lived within tension his entire life. It shaped how he breathed, how he moved, how he thought. He knew when something was shifting long before it became visible. At night, when the house quieted and routines loosened, he allowed himself moments of reflection he could never share. He considered how fragile the structures around him truly were, how dependent they were on compliance, how easily they might fracture if challenged in the wrong way. But he did not consider rebellion, not openly. Rebellion was a luxury reserved for those with options. His survival depended on restraint, not defiance. He understood that better than anyone. Still, something about the widow's presence disrupted the familiar calculus. Her authority was not inherited in the same way her husband's had been. It was provisional, contested, and watched. This made her both powerful and vulnerable. He recognized vulnerability when he saw it. It was something the city exploited mercilessly. He observed how she carried herself in public versus private spaces, how her composure tightened under scrutiny and loosened when she believed herself unobserved. These observations were not acts of curiosity, they were habits formed by necessity. Awareness was survival. Their exchanges remained formal, yet charged with an unspoken understanding. She addressed him directly when necessary, without the casual dismissal others employed. This alone set her apart. It was not kindness in the conventional sense, but it was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement carried weight. He did not mistake this for safety. The system did not allow safety for someone in his position. He trusted structures less than people, and people less than silence. Silence had kept him alive this long. The household became a place of layered observation. Everyone watched everyone else, though not equally. He watched from below, unseen, while others watched from above, assuming they were the only ones paying attention. This imbalance gave him insight few others possessed. He noticed how the widow navigated her authority carefully, never asserting it too loudly. He recognized this strategy. It mirrored his own. Power exercised softly attracts less resistance. Both of them, in their own ways, were learning how to exist within constraints designed to limit them. The city would never acknowledge this parallel. It insisted on absolute separation between their worlds. Yet, within the walls of the house, those worlds existed closer than the law preferred. He was acutely aware of the danger of proximity. The system allowed closeness only when it reinforced hierarchy. Anything else was a threat. He kept his distance physically and emotionally, even as circumstances drew them into shared spaces. Time passed, and nothing overt occurred. That was precisely what made the situation so precarious. The absence of visible transgression created a false sense of stability. The city relied on visibility to enforce its rules. What happened quietly escaped immediate notice. He understood that survival often depended on being underestimated. He had lived his entire life under that assumption. The widow, too, was being underestimated in different ways. The city believed it understood her trajectory. He was not so certain. He did not allow himself to imagine futures. Hope was dangerous. It created expectations the world was eager to punish. Still, awareness changed him. Recognition, once experienced, could not be undone. The system required him to be a thing, not a person. Yet moments of acknowledgement chipped away at that imposed identity. This did not free him, but it complicated his existence in ways he could not ignore. He remained careful. He had to. The law did not forgive mistakes, and society did not forgive perceived insolence. Any misstep could be fatal, not just to him, but to others connected to him. The widow's household continued to operate smoothly, reinforcing the illusion that nothing had changed. To the city, it was a respectable home, managed by a grieving woman awaiting her next role. To those within its walls, the atmosphere was more complex. He sensed that whatever was forming was not intentional, it was not planned, it emerged from circumstance, proximity, and awareness. These were the most dangerous kinds of developments because they resisted easy control. History often marks its turning points with declarations, but real change begins elsewhere. It begins in recognition, in the quiet realization that the rules governing one's life are not as immutable as they appear. He did not know what would come next. He only knew that the familiar balance had shifted. The widow's presence, her authority, and her awareness intersected with his existence in ways the system could not easily reconcile. Nothing had been said, nothing had been done, and yet the foundations of the story were already in place. The city remained unaware, confident in its order, while within a single household, lines that were never meant to blur were beginning to lose their sharpness. And when those lines finally did blur, Mobile would respond as it always had, with fear, force, and erasure. But for now, the danger lived quietly, suspended in silence, waiting for the moment when restraint would no longer be enough. The lines between caution and curiosity are often thinner than anyone admits, and in the widow's household, those lines were beginning to blur. It started with the smallest of actions, subtle gestures that might have gone unnoticed in another context but could never escape the scrutiny of two people who had learned to observe carefully. A look held slightly too long, a pause before responding, a question asked in a tone meant only for the ears of one person. The city outside would have labeled these as insignificant, harmless even, but within the walls their weight was palpable. The widow moved through her home with deliberate attention. She measured the timbre of her voice, the inflection of a command, the sway of her posture. She was aware that she had inherited power she had never sought, a precarious authority that could be taken from her as easily as it had been granted. Yet she began to test its edges in ways that were quiet but meaningful. She asked questions that probed competence, not obedience, and she noticed how the man without a name responded. He offered solutions, not challenges, but his demeanor suggested more than mere compliance. It suggested understanding, and understanding in a household like this was dangerous. The man, in turn, found himself navigating a landscape more complex than any labor he had performed before. His existence had been simple once: follow instructions, remain unseen, endure. Now he was forced to consider subtleties in every glance, every word, every silence. The widow's presence disrupted the patterns he had memorized. Her questions, the way she observed outcomes, and the imperceptible ways she tested boundaries forced him to recognize her as something more than a transient figure of authority. She was both part of the structure and an anomaly within it, and anomalies demanded attention, even from those trained to ignore them. It was in the quiet moments that the tension was most intense, when the household settled into the rhythms of evening and the servants moved about in muted compliance. Small exchanges took on outsized importance. A shared glance across a room, a subtle nod, the placement of objects with consideration of another's path. These became a language all their own. Nothing overt was said, yet communication flowed through these imperceptible channels, crafting a connection that was neither declared nor forbidden, but existed nonetheless in a liminal space the city could not define. Outside the walls, Mobile continued its routine with unshakable confidence. Markets buzzed with predictable noise, ships arrived and departed according to their schedules, and the city maintained the illusion of stability. Yet stability, as the widow and the man experienced it, was a fragile mask. Within the household, the air was charged with anticipation, the kind that comes from recognition of potential danger and possibility simultaneously. Each action had consequences beyond its immediate effect, and each silence was as potent as spoken words. This tension became a game of observation. Each tried to understand the other without revealing the full measure of their awareness. For the widow, this was a delicate balance, to exercise authority while concealing curiosity that could be misconstrued as weakness or impropriety. For the man, it was a constant exercise in discernment, to act in compliance while acknowledging subtleties that gave him insight into a world that systematically denied him autonomy. Every decision, every movement was measured against invisible criteria, and the rules were not written anywhere he could consult. They were inherited from centuries of fear and hierarchy, and yet they were being quietly tested from within. The household itself seemed to respond to these shifts. Walls that had once felt imposing became confining, yet at the same time, they offered spaces where risk could be calculated. Rooms that were meant only for work or passage now became arenas of subtle negotiation, where a gesture might communicate more than any word could. The architecture of the home, intentionally or not, created corridors of power and concealment, and both the widow and the man were acutely aware of how to navigate them. Their awareness of space, timing, and attention became a silent dialogue that outsiders could never perceive. Every routine within the home was now a potential source of revelation. The order of meals, the handling of household accounts, the delegation of chores, all of these mundane activities carried undercurrents that tested loyalty, discretion, and perception. Small mistakes could be magnified, but so could small acts of courage or insight. The widow began to see patterns in the way the man worked that suggested intelligence and patience beyond what the city's records could acknowledge. He understood the consequences of missteps without ever needing instruction, a quality that did not escape her notice. It was during these observations that subtle emotional currents began to surface, unspoken yet undeniable. They were not expressions of conventional attachment or affection, but they were charged nonetheless. Recognition, in this context, was dangerous because it implied agency. The city refused to allow agency for him, and it expected her to remain bound by its prescribed social rules. Yet in the household, reality diverged from law. Two people were navigating the impossible, negotiating space, power, and perception in a manner that defied conventional boundaries. At times, their interactions flirted with imbalance, moments when a look or a gesture seemed to challenge the constraints imposed by the world outside. These moments were brief and quickly corrected, yet they left a residue of tension that neither could ignore. The city, with its reliance on visibility and conformity, would have labeled such moments as inconsequential, but within the household, they were profound. Each moment of understanding or mutual acknowledgement was an assertion of identity, a quiet resistance to erasure. The man's understanding of risk was precise. He recognized the importance of timing, of restraint, of subtlety. Every decision was an exercise in survival, yet it was layered with a nascent awareness that the widow's presence created opportunities the law and society did not anticipate. opportunities that were not to be named or claimed, but existed nonetheless in the spaces between expectation and action. Awareness, he realized, was the first step toward possibility, and possibility was inherently dangerous. For the widow, the stakes were equally high. Her grief was now intertwined with the responsibilities of authority, and her observations of the man challenged the assumptions she had inherited from society. She began to understand that the structures around her were neither absolute nor immutable. The system demanded conformity, but human awareness, subtlety, and intelligence created loopholes. Her challenge became not simply one of maintaining order, but of navigating these spaces where the rules were tested in silence. It was not love, not yet, and perhaps not ever in the conventional sense, but it was something that resonated with equal intensity, recognition, understanding, and the silent acknowledgement of shared danger. This unspoken communication created a tension that was almost palpable, a constant awareness that their choices carried weight far beyond what the city could measure. They were two people maneuvering within constraints that sought to define and limit them, yet they were doing so with the awareness that each move mattered more than it should. The presence of others in the household added layers of complexity. Servants, family members, neighbors, and visitors all operated according to expectation, yet even their routine behavior contributed to the intricate web of observation and calculation. Every action had to be accounted for, and the widow and the man learned quickly how to read these behaviors, distinguishing between routine compliance and subtle deviation. The household became a living map of power and perception, and mastery of this map became essential for survival. As days and weeks passed, the tension evolved. What had begun as cautious observation grew into a more deliberate pattern of engagement. The widow began to test boundaries, not recklessly but intentionally, probing to see how far influence could extend without triggering alarm. The man responded with equal care, offering insight and assistance without stepping into visibility that might provoke punishment. Each action, each choice, reinforced a growing understanding. The household was no longer a static structure, but a dynamic space of negotiation. Silence became a language. Moments when words might have been spoken were filled with meaning through gestures, glances, and subtle adjustments of behavior. These small interactions carried more weight than the city would ever comprehend. Each was a calculated risk, yet necessary for navigating a reality where visibility could destroy lives and discretion could preserve them. The larger world continued in its ignorance. Mobile carried on as though nothing had changed, confident in the solidity of its social hierarchy. The city did not perceive the quiet disruption within a single household, unaware that human awareness and intelligence were quietly bending the rules it had imposed. That ignorance was both a shield and a threat. It allowed for subtle subversions to occur, but it also amplified the stakes. If discovered, the consequences would be catastrophic. In this environment, time itself took on a different character. Days were measured not only by work or routine but by observation and calculation. Each hour carried layers of consequence, and each night was a pause filled with reflection and preparation. Anticipation became a constant companion, a quiet tension that shaped behavior and heightened awareness. There was no room for complacency, no time for distraction. Every decision mattered, and so the lines continued to blur. The widow and the man navigated a complex dance of recognition and restraint, each aware of the other's presence in ways that the world outside could not acknowledge. The rules of the city demanded separation, but the reality within the household created conditions where separation was impossible. Every glance, every pause, every subtle gesture became part of a larger story that was forming quietly, invisibly, yet with profound significance. The story that emerged was not one of overt rebellion, nor was it one of open defiance. It was a story of awareness, of negotiation, of human intelligence and perception asserting itself against a system that sought to deny it. It was dangerous, not because it had yet broken any laws, but because it existed in a space the law could not see. And history, as it often does, would remember such stories not for what was spoken or recorded, but for what occurred in the shadows, where observation and awareness reshaped the boundaries of possibility. The moment of reckoning had not yet arrived, but its seeds were planted. Within a single household, in the city that believed itself stable and unyielding, the first subtle cracks in the system had begun to appear. Lines that were never meant to blur had started to waver, and the consequences of their eventual crossing loomed silently over every action, every choice, every glance. In the quiet, in the careful calculation of gestures and words, history was being written, and the city, confident in its order, remained oblivious. The law in Mobile was absolute. It did not bend, it did not pause, and it did not excuse. Its authority was enforced not only through the courts, but through social expectation, gossip, and fear. Miscegenation, the crossing of racial boundaries in intimate or marital unions, was considered one of the gravest offenses the city could punish. The statutes were explicit. White women were forbidden from marrying black men, and any violation carried consequences so severe that even whispering about the possibility could bring shame, exile, or physical punishment. Laws like these were meant to protect the social order, yet they functioned less as instruments of justice and more as instruments of control, shaping thought, behavior, and desire with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The widow knew these laws intimately, not because she had ever studied them formally, but because she had lived within a society structured around their enforcement. Every glance, every movement, every conversation she had navigated was filtered through their omnipresent weight. She understood the city's unspoken assumption: obedience was not optional, curiosity was dangerous, and deviation was punishable. Even now, after the loss of her husband, the law was not a distant abstraction. It was a shadow constantly looming over her life, shaping her every decision. For the man who had no name, the law was an even more immediate threat. He existed in the city's eyes as property, a possession whose life and liberty were contingent entirely upon the whims of others. For him, legality was not theoretical. It was the difference between survival and erasure. Every interaction, every misstep, every perceived transgression was magnified by this imbalance of power. The rules were rigid, and yet within the household, those rules were being quietly tested. The mere presence of the widow's authority created a space where observation could become recognition, where compliance could become negotiation, and where acknowledgement of personhood could emerge in a world that denied it. The danger of miscegenation was not solely in breaking statutes, but in violating the moral and social codes that the city upheld as unquestionable. To cross this boundary was to disrupt the hierarchy upon which every household, every institution, every expectation rested. Mobile relied on fear to reinforce obedience, and the penalties for defiance were both practical and symbolic. They reminded everyone that transgression was not just illegal, but inherently shameful, and that punishment was as much about deterrence as it was about retribution. The law was a performance, and those who attempted to navigate its limits did so at their own peril. Despite these dangers, subtle forces were at work. Human emotion rarely conformed to statute, and human curiosity rarely submitted entirely to fear. Within the widow's household, moments of acknowledgement and recognition emerged, delicate and dangerous, like threads pulling at a tapestry woven too tightly. These threads were invisible to the outside world, but charged with potential, containing the quiet power to disrupt the meticulously constructed order. Each look, each pause, each carefully measured gesture became a negotiation of possibility within boundaries the law had declared absolute. The widow was keenly aware of the risks. She understood that authority came with limitations, and that any miscalculation could destroy her carefully maintained reputation. Mobile society was structured to observe deviation instantly and to punish it decisively. She had seen women ostracized, property seized, and families humiliated simply for failing to conform to expectation. The cost of stepping outside the lines was extreme, yet the pull of curiosity, awareness, and subtle assertion of agency was growing stronger with each passing day. For the man, the stakes were existential. Survival depended upon understanding not only the rules themselves, but the nuances of enforcement. The city could act violently, unpredictably, and with cruelty, and the household was a microcosm of this uncertainty. Even minor deviations could trigger disproportionate consequences, and yet within the carefully monitored interactions with the widow, he perceived possibilities that the law could not contain. The space between obedience and awareness became a delicate theater, a place where survival, intelligence, and opportunity intersected in ways both compelling and dangerous. The tension intensified as their silent recognition grew. Each interaction required careful calibration. Speaking too freely, acting with undue initiative, or even allowing a look to linger too long could provoke suspicion. Yet restraint had its own dangers. Failure to respond appropriately could signal weakness or disloyalty. Every gesture, every word, every pause carried meaning beyond its immediate context. In this environment, simple actions became loaded with risk and consequence. Mobile's legal structure relied heavily on visibility. Acts that could be witnessed were punished with certainty. Acts that occurred in silence, subtlety, or negotiation were harder to enforce. This gap between observation and enforcement created a narrow corridor in which the widow and the man operated. It was a corridor filled with tension, a place where restraint and awareness coexisted, and where every step was a negotiation with unseen forces. The widow began to test boundaries incrementally. She asked questions that were not strictly necessary, observed outcomes more critically, and engaged the man in ways that skirted formal expectation. These were small acts, invisible to anyone outside the household, but they introduced a new dynamic into a system built on predictability and fear. By testing the limits quietly, she was asserting a form of power the law could not anticipate, and in doing so, she created a subtle but undeniable connection with the man whose life had been constrained entirely by statute. The man, in turn, responded with equal care. He offered insights when asked, yet never overstepped. He recognized that the widow's curiosity was dangerous but also transformative. To acknowledge his intelligence, competence, or presence was to risk both their safety, yet ignoring it would squander opportunity. Each interaction became a silent negotiation of trust, awareness, and mutual recognition. The household itself became a stage for this careful play. Servants moved with their own sense of observation, aware of authority but uncertain of its limits. Neighbors and family members provided external pressures, their expectations implicit and constant. In this environment, awareness itself became a tool, a weapon, and a shield. The widow and the man developed a rhythm, a pattern of recognition and restraint that allowed subtle assertion without detection. Every day reinforced the danger of deviation. Gossip traveled quickly in Mobile, and rumor functioned as an auxiliary form of law. Even the faintest perception of impropriety could amplify consequences, and yet, within the household, the boundaries between legality, morality, and human awareness were being quietly tested. Recognition, the mere act of acknowledging one another's presence beyond prescribed roles, became a political act as much as a personal one. Despite the risks, the two continued to navigate this space, each aware of the fragile balance that governed their lives. They understood that nothing overt could occur, that even the slightest appearance of impropriety could provoke the wrath of both law and society. Yet in the quiet, they explored possibilities, tested boundaries, and discovered a form of agency previously denied. Every glance, gesture, and pause became charged with meaning, creating a tension that neither could fully articulate, but both understood. The widow's increasing confidence in her authority, combined with the man's acute awareness of his environment, created an environment that was both dangerous and potent. It was a delicate dance in which the steps were invisible, the consequences immense, and the stakes existential. This interplay became the axis around which the household operated, influencing every decision, every movement, every interaction. The city outside remained oblivious. Mobile continued to function under the illusion of stability, confident in its ability to enforce law and social order. Yet inside the household, the careful balance of recognition, restraint, and subtle assertion had already begun to challenge that illusion. The boundaries the city considered absolute were being tested in silence, in ways that could never be observed from the outside. Each passing day heightened the tension. What had begun as cautious awareness had evolved into a deliberate, quiet exploration of limits. Recognition had become its own form of resistance, a subtle assa. Tian of human identity and intelligence in a system that denied both. The stakes were immense, but the moment of discovery, if it came, promised to be transformative and terrifying. In Mobile, the law ruled publicly, but silence and subtlety governed survival. The widow and the man had entered a space neither could fully control, navigating a terrain of danger, observation, and potential that few could understand. In this environment, the simple act of acknowledgement carried consequences far beyond the moment. Every decision, every gesture, every glance became a thread in a web of possibility and peril. The law could punish overt action, but it could not control awareness. And it was within this gap, the space between obedience and recognition, visibility and subtlety, that the household operated, quietly challenging the boundaries imposed by both statute and society. The danger was constant, immediate and invisible. The stakes were not hypothetical, they were a matter of life, liberty and survival. Each act of recognition, each subtle acknowledgement, was a negotiation with the law, with society and with history itself. And in this negotiation, the rules were being rewritten, quietly, invisibly, within a single household that the city considered predictable and controlled. The revelation did not arrive as a thunderclap. It came slowly, like a shadow lengthening over the floor, unnoticed until it had already claimed the room. Within the widow's household, the invisible threads of awareness and recognition had been quietly gathering strength for months, weaving together a pattern that was impossible to ignore. It began with small things, a look that lingered too long, a hand placed with intentional care, a question that hinted at curiosity beyond what the law or custom allowed. These moments were fleeting, but they carried weight, carrying with them the first stirrings of understanding that the world outside had no power to govern. The widow felt it first in her chest, an unfamiliar pressure that was neither grief nor anger, neither fear nor joy. It was a combination of all, tempered by the knowledge that she stood at a precipice. She understood with sudden clarity the enormity of the silent bond forming between herself and the man who had been denied even a name. That bond was dangerous, subversive, and yet undeniable. It challenged everything Mobile believed about order, hierarchy, and propriety. It was a revelation not of words, but of awareness. An understanding that the rules she had lived by were not absolute, that they could be bent in subtle ways, that human intelligence and attention could create spaces the law could never anticipate. The man understood it too, though differently. He had navigated danger all his life, learning early that survival required observation, silence, and precise action. But this revelation, the recognition that he was no longer invisible in the eyes of someone whose authority mattered, shattered assumptions. He had not realized he had been holding on to. He had been prepared to exist entirely within the shadows, but now the shadows themselves were shifting, and he had to navigate new contours he had never anticipated. The awareness that the widow saw him, not as property, not as a tool, but as a human being with agency, was at once exhilarating and terrifying. Within the household, tension became nearly tangible. Every room seemed to carry the weight of unspoken understanding, every glance and gesture loaded with meaning that was neither overt nor acknowledged aloud. The servants, oblivious to the complexity beneath the surface, continued their routines, but their movements now intersected with subtle shifts in authority and awareness that had begun to ripple outward. Every action, no matter how mundane, was refracted through the lens of this emerging revelation, changing the meaning of ordinary tasks and infusing them with unexpected significance. The widow began to test boundaries more deliberately. She asked questions that probed competence and character, questions that seemed casual but were loaded with implication. She allowed herself moments of observation that skirted the edges of propriety, carefully noting how he responded to challenges that required judgment rather than mere obedience. Each interaction was a silent negotiation, a deliberate calibration of trust and awareness, and she felt the weight of potential consequence in every decision. The city had taught her that a single misstep could destroy reputation and social standing, yet she found herself unable to resist the subtle assertion of agency that came with observing him as a person, not a possession. For the man, the stakes were existential. One wrong move, one gesture misinterpreted, could provoke disaster. Yet the revelation had opened a narrow corridor of possibility. Awareness was power, even if it was power exercised invisibly. He began to see the contours of influence that existed within the household, the ways in which discretion, intelligence, and careful timing could shift outcomes without attracting notice. Each interaction with the widow became an exercise in subtlety, a demonstration of skill in navigating a world that demanded invisibility but could not completely enforce it. Recognition, he realized, was a kind of currency, one that had to be spent with care. The dynamics between them evolved, imperceptibly at first, then more decisively. The quiet acknowledgement of one another's presence began to manifest in subtle changes in behavior. A suggestion offered when it could be ignored, a decision supported silently, a boundary respected without comment. These were not acts of rebellion, but they were revolutionary in a world designed to suppress initiative and enforce hierarchy. Every choice they made in these small moments was laden with risk and consequence, and yet it was also laden with possibility. Mobile outside remained oblivious. The city continued its routines. Why? Unshakable confidence, convinced in the stability of law, custom, and hierarchy. Merchants counted their profits, clerks tallied ledgers, and neighbors whispered as always, secure in the belief that transgression could not go unseen. Yet within this single household, rules that were assumed absolute were being quietly bent. The law could punish the visible, but it could not govern awareness. Recognition, subtle and silent, was a force the city had failed to anticipate. The revelation intensified as they began to navigate moments of shared observation. Each movement, each gesture, each pause became part of an invisible dialogue, a communication of understanding that required neither words nor acknowledgement. They were operating in a liminal space, where the rules of the city were suspended, where agency and intelligence could be exercised without detection, and where human recognition carried consequences far beyond immediate comprehension. This was the true danger, not open defiance, but the emergence of awareness, the assertion of personhood in a system designed to deny it. The tension extended beyond the household, touching the edges of society itself. Outsiders continued to expect conformity, yet the subtle shifts in the widow and the man's interactions created ripples that could not be contained. If observed, the city would interpret them as scandalous, impossible, threatening. But for now, the revelation remained invisible, protected by silence and careful timing. It was a secret existing in plain sight, unacknowledged but potent, a force quietly reshaping the dynamics of power and recognition. Within these dynamics, emotional undercurrents emerged. Not conventional love, not yet, but a profound awareness of mutual reliance, intelligence, and observation. Recognition itself became a tether, binding them together in a way the city would never permit and could never understand. It was a connection forged not through words or declarations, but through shared understanding, subtle acknowledgement, and the quiet negotiation of boundaries. This connection was dangerous, transformative, and exhilarating, and it carried with it the inevitability of confrontation. The revelation forced both of them to reconsider everything they had believed about authority, hierarchy, and obedience. The widow began to see that power was not solely the province of the law or social convention. It could be exercised quietly, subtly, and with awareness. The man began to understand that his existence, though legally constrained, contained spaces where intelligence and observation allowed him influence. Together, their awareness challenged the assumptions of a system that claimed total control but relied on conformity and silence. Danger was omnipresent. The laws of Mobile were unforgiving, society merciless, and gossip lethal. One misstep could unravel everything they had built in silence, yet the revelation gave them insight, and insight was a rare and valuable resource. It allowed them to anticipate consequences, navigate risk, and shape outcomes without overtly violating rules. Each day of careful recognition reinforced a tenuous balance, a quiet resistance that carried the potential for disaster and transformation in equal measure. The household itself became a microcosm of possibility and peril. Every action, however mundane, was loaded with significance. Decisions about the allocation of chores, the handling of correspondence, even the placement of objects in the home, became exercises in navigation, subtle demonstration of awareness, and tests of trust. The revelation was never announced, never named, but it shaped every movement, thought, and decision. It existed in the margins, in the spaces between command and compliance, observation and acknowledgement. With each passing day, the stakes grew. Recognition had consequences, subtle but unavoidable. Awareness could be transformed into action, and action, even if hidden, risked exposure. They moved through the household with heightened attention, measuring every interaction, every gesture, every word. Silence was both shield and weapon, a tool to preserve life and assert agency. The city outside remained unaware, confident in its order, while inside, invisible forces were quietly reshaping the boundaries of law, morality, and hierarchy. And so the revelation continued, unfolding in silence, awareness, and subtle negotiation. It was neither celebrated nor spoken of, yet it existed with undeniable force, shaping decisions, creating tension, and redefining the possibilities for both widow and man. Within the household, history was being written in the shadows, beyond the reach of law and society, in a language of recognition, observation, and human intelligence. The aftermath of revelation is rarely immediate. It does not arrive with fanfare or declaration, but seeps in quietly, altering the landscape of thought, emotion, and expectation. Within the widow's household, the consequences of awareness and recognition began to assert themselves in ways both subtle and unavoidable. Each interaction now carried the residue of knowledge, the understanding that boundaries had been tested and rules quietly bent. Every glance, gesture, and unspoken communication was imbued with meaning far beyond its immediate context. The city outside remained unaware, confident in its laws and hierarchy, but the house itself had become a theater of consequence, a space where actions and awareness collided to reshape the very structure of authority and survival. The widow moved through her days with a careful balance of grief, responsibility, and emerging assertion. Mourning had initially dictated her behavior, confining her within socially acceptable expressions of loss, yet as the days lengthened, it became apparent that grief alone could no longer define her. Authority had shifted entirely onto her shoulders, and with it came both opportunity and peril. She began to exercise judge me, more decisively, to ask questions that probed the limits of competence and character, and to observe with a precision that unsettled those around her. This careful attention, once subtle, had grown into a form of influence, and influence, even exercised quietly, carried power and danger in equal measure. For the man who had no name, every day became a negotiation of survival. His existence, legally defined as property, left him with little room for agency, yet the revelation had created spaces in which intelligence and awareness could operate invisibly. He moved with deliberate caution, offering insight only when necessary, speaking only when prompted, and observing constantly. Each action was an exercise in restraint, yet every interaction with the widow carried the weight of unspoken acknowledgement. Recognition had become a silent currency, and navigating its use required skill, foresight, and patience. The household itself responded to these shifts. Rooms once navigated purely for routine now became arenas of subtle negotiation. Servants carried out duties unaware that each movement intersected with layers of awareness, while the widow and the man maneuvered within these invisible channels, carefully calibrating action and observation. Objects placed with intentionality, doors opened or closed with timing in mind, even the simplest tasks carried meaning. Every element of domestic life became a part of a larger, unspoken choreography, a web of observation and discretion that allowed them to exist in a space the city could neither measure nor comprehend. Outside, mobile carried on with confident normalcy. Laws were obeyed publicly, routines maintained, and society reassured itself with appearances of stability. Yet the household had become a locus of invisible disruption. The rules, rigid and absolute in theory, were quietly tested in practice. Each moment of recognition, each gesture of acknowledgement, carried the potential to alter the social and legal assumptions that underpinned the city. Awareness had become a force neither legal nor moral, a kind of invisible power that existed in the margins, beyond surveillance, yet consequential nonetheless. Tension within the household escalated as these subtle dynamics became more pronounced. Both widow and man were acutely aware of the stakes. The law could punish overt action, society could punish impropriety, Yet silence and subtlety allowed influence to be exercised without detection. Each interaction became a calculated balance of risk and possibility, with the understanding that the consequences of misjudgment could be catastrophic. Every word, every gesture, and every pause carried layered significance, and both navigated these waters with heightened vigilance. Emotion, long suppressed under the weight of law and social expectation, began to surface in these interactions, not as overt attachment, but as an awareness of mutual reliance, intelligence, and perception. The widow recognized in him a mind capable of understanding nuance, foresight, and survival under constraint. The man recognized in her the capacity to wield authority with subtlety, discretion, and careful judgment. These acknowledgments, silent and invisible, created a tether between them, binding them in ways the city could neither sanction nor perceive. It was an emotional landscape fraught with risk, charged with tension, and impossible to articulate aloud. The widow's influence grew incrementally. Decisions about household management, distribution of responsibilities, and engagement with outsiders were now informed by her increasing confidence in observing and directing outcomes. She tested limits quietly, probing how much discretion could be exercised before attracting notice. The man's responses reinforced this understanding. His insight and patience demonstrated that subtle negotiation of power was possible even within a system designed to suppress agency. Together, they operated in a realm where awareness became strategy, observation became power, and silence became both shield and weapon. As the days turned into weeks, small crises began to emerge. Situations that would have been handled mechanically before now carried amplified significance. Misplaced objects, slight delays in tasks, or ambiguous behavior could trigger misinterpretation, yet also offered opportunities for quiet assertion. The widow and the man, attuned to one another, navigated these moments with precision. Each crisis became a test of awareness, a measure of control, and a demonstration of the fragile but potent influence they could exert without overtly challenging authority. Their connection, though unspoken, became increasingly evident to themselves. It was not a conventional bond, not founded on affection or desire alone, but on shared understanding and the recognition of constraint and opportunity. They had learned to communicate in the spaces between words, to negotiate risks silently, and to observe consequences without drawing attention. Every interaction deepened this understanding, forging a relationship that was both strategic and intensely human, born from necessity and the rare acknowledgement of personhood in a system designed to erase it. Outside forces began to press on the household indirectly. Neighbors, family members, and the wider city community continued their routines, applying social pressure in ways the widow could anticipate but not entirely control. Gossip, rumor, and subtle judgment functioned as external surveillance, a constant reminder of the stakes involved in every choice. Yet the revelation, the understanding forged within the walls of the household, allowed the widow and the man to operate in ways the city could not measure. Recognition became both a tool of resistance and a mechanism for navigating an environment structured to deny autonomy. Moments of risk increased in intensity. A word overheard in the wrong tone, a gesture misread, or an ambiguous glance accompany trigger scrutiny. Yet each test of awareness, each careful assertion reinforced the delicate balance of power. The widow observed not only the man, but the responses of all around her, measuring intention, assessing consequence, and refining strategy. The man, similarly, monitored the environment, reading the patterns of behavior, identifying openings for subtle action, and calibrating his responses to maintain both survival and agency. Time became a crucible. Each day layered observation, awareness, and subtle negotiation upon the previous, intensifying tension while offering narrow spaces for maneuver. The widow and the man had entered a rhythm where every decision was informed by consequence, every silence pregnant with meaning, and every gesture charged with potential impact. The household was a microcosm of strategy, perception, and restraint, a world unto itself where the rules of the city were quietly subverted through observation, discretion, and intelligence. Despite the invisible power they wielded, danger remained ever present. Mobile's laws, societal expectations, and the watchful eyes of neighbors were constant threats. The city assumed control, but the household had become a locus of subtle rebellion. Recognition had become a form of resistance, awareness a weapon, and silence a shield. The aftermath of revelation was thus not a single event, but an ongoing negotiation of existence, authority, and survival, conducted in a realm the world could not perceive. And so the household moved forward, poised between visibility and invisibility, obedience and awareness, law and subtle defiance. Every day tested limits, measured consequence, and explored possibility. The widow and the man navigated a space neither fully controlled, yet fully understood by them both. Their connection, forged in recognition and silence, shaped every moment, every choice, every interaction. In the quiet of the house, in the shadow of law, history was being written not in words, but in gestures, observation, and awareness. The consequences of this revelation were not yet visible to the city, but they were inexorable. Each action, each recognition, each silent negotiation was a step toward a transformation that neither law nor society could dictate. The household, once a space of routine and compliance, had become a crucible of tension, intelligence, and subtle resistance. The aftermath of revelation had arrived, silent and pervasive, shaping not only behavior but the very possibilities of survival, agency, and human recognition within a system built to deny them. Legacy is a strange thing. It does not always manifest in monuments, statutes, or recorded history. Often, it exists in shadows, whispered in silence, preserved in the fragile memory of those who survived to witness it. Within the widow's household, the consequences of recognition, awareness, and subtle negotiation had become the very foundation of such a legacy. The city outside, confident in its order and law, had no understanding that a story had unfolded in the quiet spaces of domestic life, a story that challenged hierarchy, defied expectation, and whispered of possibility in a world designed to deny it. The household moved with a rhythm both familiar and extraordinary. Daily routines continued, the preparation of meals, the cleaning of rooms, the attending to visitors, but each act carried the residue of months of observation, negotiation, and silent acknowledgement. Nothing had been overtly transgressive, yet everything had changed. The widow had learned to exercise authority with subtlety, recognizing that power could exist not only in command, but in awareness, patience, and careful calculation. She had learned that influence could be exerted quietly, invisibly, and without provoking the full force of the law or social expectation. The man, similarly, had transformed in ways that would never be formally recorded. He had moved from a position defined entirely by ownership to one shaped by awareness, skill, and discretion. His existence, though still legally constrained, had become a series of carefully negotiated interactions in which agency, intelligence, and recognition allowed him influence the city could not perceive. He had learned to operate within the margins, to turn observation into power, and to exist not merely as property, but as a participant in a subtle, invisible narrative that the law could neither define nor control. Together, their silent partnership, unspoken, invisible, and fraught with risk, became a mechanism through which the household survived, adapted, and even thrived. Awareness was a form of currency, and in its careful exchange, both widow and man had discovered a space of freedom that the city could never formally sanction. Every decision, every gesture, every measured pause carried the potential for consequence, yet also for empowerment. This was a legacy not written on paper, not sung in ballads, and not recognized by society. It existed in the delicate interplay of intelligence, observation, and survival. Yet legacy is never free from tension or danger. The city, with its rigid social hierarchies and unyielding laws, remained a looming presence. Gossip, judgment, and surveillance persisted beyond the walls of the household, reminding both widow and man of the fragility of their existence. Recognition was a powerful force, but it was invisible. Should it be discovered, consequences would be immediate, severe, and inescapable. This awareness of law, of observation, of potential exposure infused every action with gravity. Life, in this context, was a continuous negotiation between survival and agency, visibility and discretion, obedience and the quiet assertion of humanity. The widow's authority evolved into something remarkable within these constraints. She learned to manipulate perception without revealing intention, to assert influence without creating overt disruption. She observed the responses of all within our household, anticipating actions, guiding behavior, and exercising judgment with precision. Authority, she discovered, was not simply a matter of law or status. It was a matter of perception, attention, and understanding. The legacy she created, though invisible to the world, was profound, the quiet reshaping of power and influence through intelligence, subtlety, and careful negotiation. For the man, survival became intertwined with mastery of these same dynamics. He had learned to exist not only within the constraints imposed by law, but within the subtle spaces created by observation and discretion. Each decision was a calculated exercise in awareness, each gesture an assertion of competence and intelligence. Recognition from the widow was a tool and a danger, a means of influence and a test of restraint. Together, their interactions created a microcosm in which the rules of the city were not abolished, but reinterpreted, subtly and invisibly, in ways that ensured both survival and influence. Emotion, long suppressed by fear, expectation and law, found expression in subtle forms. It was not conventional affection, nor was it openly articulated, yet it was no less powerful. Moments of acknowledgement, understanding and shared attention became a form of connection, a tether forged through necessity and insight. This connection, though invisible to the world, was potent, shaping decisions, reinforcing survival strategies, and creating a private narrative of human awareness in a city that systematically denied it. Time in the household assumed a different quality. Days were measured not only by work or routine, but by observation, calculation, and the silent negotiation of consequence. Every hour carried layers of meaning, every pause was an opportunity for reflection, and every glance contained potential revelation. The rhythm of life became a subtle dance, choreographed by awareness, discretion, and intelligence, where every step mattered. The world outside continued in its ignorance, confident that order prevailed, while inside, history was being written in shadows. The legacy of this time extended beyond immediate survival. It was a demonstration that human agency, awareness, and intelligence could exist even under extreme constraint. The widow and the man had created a space in which recognition, observation, and subtle negotiation allowed the impossible to exist quietly and invisibly. These lessons, unspoken and undocumented, would resonate beyond their immediate lives, a testament to the resilience of human spirit and the power of intelligence in negotiating the boundaries of law, custom, and expectation. Yet the danger remained omnipresent. Mobile's laws, societal norms, and expectations of propriety were unforgiving, and any breach, however subtle, could provoke severe consequences. Recognition and awareness were both tools and threats. They allowed navigation of constraints, yet they carried the constant possibility of exposure. Every action, gesture, and choice remained measured against this reality. Survival required vigilance, intelligence, and discretion, and these qualities had become the defining features of both widow and man within their shared environment. Even as the immediate danger persisted, the household continued to function with an air of quiet authority and precision. Decisions were made thoughtfully, actions executed with intention, and behavior guided by both risk and opportunity. Observation remained central to survival. Each interaction was analyzed, interpreted, and carefully adjusted. The legacy of recognition and subtle negotiation shaped the very fabric of daily life, creating a structure in which human agency could be exercised without overt transgression, in which influence could exist without visibility, and in which survival and subtle empowerment coexisted. As the weeks and months passed, the household became a repository of unspoken lessons. It demonstrated that power, recognition, and awareness could exist even in a city designed to deny them. It showed that human intelligence, patience, and discretion could carve spaces of freedom within rigid structures of control, and it revealed that connections forged in observation and recognition, though invisible to the world, could have profound effects on behavior, authority, and the possibility of subtle resistance. In the end, the legacy of this household was not a story written in law books, journals, or newspapers. It existed in the quiet understanding between two individuals who had navigated danger, observation, and recognition with intelligence and restraint. It existed in the subtle shifts of authority, the careful negotiation of consequence, and the invisible assertion of human agency within a system designed to suppress it. It existed in shadows, in silences, in gestures too fleeting for outsiders to perceive, and yet it was as powerful as any act recorded by history. And so, the household endured. Its lessons remained unspoken, its story largely invisible, yet the consequences of recognition, observation, and subtle negotiation would ripple forward in ways the city could never anticipate. Mobile continued in its law, its hierarchy, its confident ignorance, while within a single home, the rules had been quietly rewritten, the boundaries subtly tested, and the impossible made possible. The legacy of awareness, intelligence, and human recognition persisted, unrecorded, invisible, yet indelibly real, a testament to the resilience and cunning of those who refused to be erased.